From the captivating allure of Renaissance paintings to the glossy pages of fashion magazines and the flickering screens of our digital devices, the female form has long held a captivating presence in visual culture. But how often do we pause to consider the lens through which we are invited to view these images? Who is doing the looking, and, more importantly, what narratives and power dynamics are embedded within their gaze? This exploration delves into the complex and often unsettling realm of the male gaze, a concept that has sparked decades of debate and ignited a critical examination of how visual media shapes our understanding of gender, sexuality, and power. The term male gaze, coined by feminist film theorist Laura Mulvey in her seminal 1975 essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, refers to the tendency of visual media to depict the world from a masculine, heterosexual perspective, often objectifying and sexualizing women in the process. This gaze, Mulvey argued, is not merely a neutral act of observation but rather a powerful force that reinforces patriarchal power structures and shapes our understanding of what it means to be a woman in a society where men have historically held the reins of both representation and interpretation. Imagine, for a moment, the iconic scene in Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window, where Grace Kelly, bathed in a single source of light, moves gracefully about her apartment, unaware of the voyeuristic gaze of James Stewart's character. The camera lingers on her body, emphasizing her elegance and beauty, yet simultaneously objectifying her, turning her into a spectacle for both the male protagonist and, by extension, the audience watching the film. This, Mulvey argues, is a prime example of how the male gaze operates, positioning women as objects to be looked at, their worth often determined by their adherence to societal standards of beauty and desirability. But the male gaze is not confined to the realm of classic Hollywood cinema. It permeates our visual landscape, infiltrating advertising, social media, and even the seemingly innocuous imagery we encounter in our daily lives. Think of the perfume commercials that equate a woman's allure with her ability to attract male attention, or the fashion spreads that showcase impossibly thin and perfectly styled models, perpetuating unrealistic beauty standards that leave many women feeling inadequate. This constant bombardment of idealized images, often digitally altered to achieve an unattainable standard of perfection, can have a profoundly detrimental impact on women's self-image and self-esteem, fueling a never-ending cycle of self-doubt and body image issues. Our journey into the heart of the male gaze will take us through the historical roots of this phenomenon, exploring how centuries of art, literature, and cultural norms have shaped the ways in which women are depicted and perceived. We'll delve into the psychoanalytic foundations of looking and being looked at, drawing upon the work of Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan to understand the complex interplay of desire, power, and visual pleasure. We'll examine the mechanics of the male gaze, analyzing how specific cinematic techniques, from camera angles to lighting and editing, contribute to the objectification and fragmentation of the female form. But our exploration doesn't end with critique. We'll also delve into the empowering realm of the female gaze, a term that encompasses the ways in which women, informed by their lived experiences and unique perspectives, engage with and challenge traditional representations of gender and sexuality. We'll celebrate the work of female filmmakers, photographers, and artists who are subverting the male gaze, offering alternative visions of womanhood that prioritize agency, complexity, and authenticity over objectification and male approval. Finally, we'll confront the contemporary implications and challenges of the male gaze in our digitally mediated world, examining how social media, advertising, and popular culture continue to shape our perceptions of gender and influence our understanding of what it means to be a woman in the 21st century. This is not just an academic exercise, it's a call to action, an invitation to become more critical consumers of visual media, to challenge the status quo, and to champion a more diverse and equitable representation of women in all their complexity and beauty. 1. Historical context and origins. The portrayal of women in media has been a subject of much debate and analysis, particularly in the context of feminist theory. For centuries, women have been relegated to the margins of storytelling, their narratives shaped by a predominantly male perspective. This essay explores the evolution of this phenomenon, examining the historical context that gave rise to the concept of the male gaze, and its profound impact on cinematic representations of gender. We'll delve into early representations of women in art and literature, where a masculine lens often prevailed, shaping perceptions and perpetuating stereotypes. Our journey will then take us through the influence of European oil paintings from the Renaissance period, where the female form, while celebrated, was often idealized and objectified. We'll analyze seminal works like John Berger's Ways of Seeing and Laura Mulvey's groundbreaking essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, which provided the vocabulary to critique and deconstruct the pervasive presence of the male gaze in art and cinema. Finally, we will examine how societal power dynamics and patriarchal ideologies continue to influence the cinematic representations of gender, perpetuating harmful stereotypes and shaping cultural perceptions. From the Venus figurines of the Paleolithic era to the delicate heroines of Victorian literature, women have long held a captivating presence in art and storytelling. However, these representations were often filtered through a masculine lens, reflecting the prevailing social norms and power dynamics of their time. In ancient Greece, for example, female figures in art were frequently depicted as idealized objects of beauty, their bodies conforming to a specific canon of proportions that emphasized youth, grace, and fertility. Take, for instance, the Venus de Milo, a renowned sculpture that embodies the classical ideal of feminine beauty. While undeniably captivating, this depiction reflects a male-centric perspective on female beauty, prioritizing aesthetic ideals over individuality and agency. This trend continued through various artistic movements. During the Renaissance, while marking a period of cultural and artistic flourishing, women were often relegated to the roles of muses, mothers, or temptresses. They were the subjects of countless paintings, yet their inner lives and complexities were rarely explored with the same depth and nuance afforded to their male counterparts. A poignant example lies in Sandro Botticelli's iconic painting, The Birth of Venus. Venus, emerging from a giant scallop shell, embodies ethereal beauty. However, she stands nude and vulnerable, her pose suggestive of passivity and available for the viewer's gaze, a gaze that, historically, has been predominantly male. Literature, too, played its part in shaping the narrative of women through a masculine lens. From the damsels in distress waiting to be rescued by chivalrous knights to the virtuous wives patiently enduring their husbands' flaws, literature often presented women as secondary characters, their lives revolving around the actions and desires of men. One striking example can be found in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. While a revolutionary novel for its exploration of female agency and desire, Jane's narrative is nonetheless framed by her relationships with men, particularly Mr. Rochester. Her identity and happiness are largely defined by her romantic pursuits, a recurring theme in Victorian literature that reflects the limited societal roles available to women at the time. The European oil paintings from the Renaissance period, with their technical mastery and captivating beauty, played a significant role in shaping cultural perceptions of the female form. However, this era also saw the solidification of the male gaze, a perspective that often idealized and objectified women, placing them within a framework of male desire and judgment. One of the most prominent examples of this can be seen in Titian's Venus of Urbino. The painting, depicting a reclining nude woman, is undeniably beautiful, but Venus's direct gaze and suggestive pose are clearly intended for a male viewer. This work, while celebrated for its artistic merit, reinforces the notion of women as passive objects of beauty, existing to be admired and possessed by men. This objectification was further emphasized through the use of light and shadow, composition, and symbolism. In many Renaissance paintings, women are bathed in soft, diffused light, their bodies rendered with a delicate sensuality that emphasizes their physical attributes. The composition of these paintings often placed women in vulnerable or subservient positions, further reinforcing their passivity. Take, for example, Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. While renowned for her enigmatic smile, Mona Lisa's hands, resting demurely in her lap, and her submissive posture speak to the societal expectations placed upon women during the Renaissance. The cultural implications of this idealized and objectified representation of women are far-reaching. By constantly presenting women as passive objects of beauty, Renaissance art helped to solidify a societal power dynamic that placed men in a position of control and dominance. This dynamic, unfortunately, continues to reverberate through history, influencing cultural perceptions of gender and perpetuating harmful stereotypes. The objectification of women in art and advertising is a pervasive issue, one that subtly but powerfully shapes our understanding of gender roles and societal expectations. John Berger's seminal work, Ways of Seeing, published in 1972, offered a groundbreaking analysis of this phenomenon, particularly focusing on the role of the male gaze in visual culture. Berger argued that traditional European art, from painting to photography, has historically been created by men for a male audience. This male gaze, according to Berger, frames the way women are depicted, often reducing them to objects of desire or passive figures defined by their relationship to men. He famously stated, "Men look at women. Women watch themselves being looked at." This quote encapsulates the heart of Berger's argument, highlighting the inherent power imbalance embedded in the act of looking. Men, through their position as the viewer, hold the power to define, objectify, and ultimately control the way women are perceived. One compelling example Berger uses is the tradition of the nude in Western art. While male nudes were often portrayed as heroic, powerful figures, female nudes were frequently depicted as passive, vulnerable, and existing for the pleasure of the assumed male viewer. This disparity in representation, Berger argues, reinforces societal power structures and perpetuates the objectification of women. Ways of Seeing extends its analysis beyond the confines of traditional art, delving into the realm of advertising, which Berger saw as a powerful contemporary manifestation of the male gaze. Advertising, he argues, utilizes the same visual language and techniques employed in classical art to sell products and perpetuate a specific image of femininity. Think, for example, of advertisements for perfume or lingerie. Women are often scantily clad, their bodies positioned in suggestive poses, their eyes inviting the viewer's gaze. This type of imagery, while seemingly innocuous, reinforces the notion that a woman's worth is inextricably tied to her physical appearance and her ability to attract male attention. Berger's work, even decades later, remains strikingly relevant. His insights into the pervasive nature of the male gaze challenged us to critically examine the images we consume daily and to question the subtle ways in which they shape our understanding of gender, power, and representation. In 1975, Laura Mulvey, a British feminist film theorist, published Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, an essay that would become a cornerstone of feminist film theory. In this groundbreaking work, Mulvey formally introduced the concept of the male gaze to the discourse, arguing that traditional Hollywood cinema operates through a system that privileges a masculine perspective, ultimately objectifying women and reinforcing patriarchal power structures. Mulvey drew heavily upon the psychoanalytic theories of Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan, particularly their work on scopophilia, the pleasure derived from looking. She argued that cinema, with its darkened theaters and immersive nature, provides an ideal space for voyeuristic pleasure, allowing viewers to indulge in the act of looking without being seen themselves. This voyeuristic pleasure, according to Mulvey, is inherently linked to the male gaze. She identified three distinct looks within cinema that contribute to this male-centric perspective: the look of the camera as it records the film, the look of the male characters at the female characters, and, finally, the look of the audience, which is assumed to identify with the male perspective. This interconnected web of gazes creates a system where women are constantly objectified, their bodies scrutinized and displayed for the pleasure of the assumed male viewer. To illustrate her point, Mulvey analyzed films like Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window and Joseph von Sternberg's Morocco, demonstrating how camera angles, editing techniques, and narrative structure all work in tandem to prioritize a male point of view and position women as objects of desire. Think of the iconic scene in Rear Window, where Grace Kelly's character is illuminated by a single light, her movements scrutinized by James Stewart's voyeuristic gaze. The camera lingers on Kelly's body, emphasizing her beauty and elegance while simultaneously objectifying her. Mulvey's essay ignited a firestorm of debate, challenging long-held assumptions about the neutrality of the cinematic gaze. Her work provided a framework for generations of film critics and scholars to analyze and deconstruct the ways in which cinema reinforces patriarchal power dynamics and perpetuates harmful gender stereotypes. The impact of visual pleasure and narrative cinema extends far beyond academia. It has encouraged a more critical engagement with popular culture, prompting filmmakers and audiences alike to question the pervasive influence of the male gaze and to advocate for more diverse and equitable representations of gender on screen. The cinematic representations of gender are not merely reflections of reality. They are powerful tools that shape our understanding of the world and our place within it. Societal power dynamics, particularly those rooted in patriarchal ideologies, have had a profound impact on the way men and women are portrayed on screen, often perpetuating harmful stereotypes and reinforcing existing power imbalances. One of the most pervasive ways in which patriarchal ideologies manifest in cinema is through the types of roles offered to men and women. Men are often cast as the heroes, the leaders, the decision-makers, their narratives driven by ambition, power, and the pursuit of justice. Women, on the other hand, are often relegated to supporting roles, love interests, mothers, or damsels in distress. Their narratives defined by their relationships with men and their roles within the domestic sphere. This disparity in representation is not accidental. It reflects a long history of societal structures that have privileged men and masculine qualities while devaluing women and feminine traits. This is not to say that all films perpetuate these stereotypes. There are countless examples of films that challenge these norms and offer more nuanced and complex representations of gender. However, it is important to acknowledge the historical context and the enduring influence of patriarchy on cinematic storytelling. Another way in which societal power dynamics shape cinematic representations of gender is through the use of language. The words used to describe male and female characters, the dialogue they are given, and even the tone of voice employed by actors all contribute to the construction of gendered identities on screen. Men are often described as strong, decisive, and assertive, while women are labeled as beautiful, nurturing, or emotional. These linguistic choices, while seemingly subtle, reinforce traditional gender roles and perpetuate the notion that men and women are inherently different. The implications of these skewed representations are significant. When audiences are constantly bombarded with images and narratives that reinforce traditional gender roles, it shapes their understanding of what is possible and acceptable for men and women in the real world. This can lead to a perpetuation of harmful stereotypes, a reluctance to challenge existing power structures, and a devaluation of feminine qualities and experiences. However, it is important to note that the cinematic landscape is constantly evolving. Filmmakers are becoming increasingly aware of the need for more diverse and equitable representation, and audiences are demanding stories that reflect the complexities of gender identity in the 21st century. By critically examining the ways in which societal power dynamics shape cinematic representations of gender, we can begin to dismantle harmful stereotypes, challenge patriarchal ideologies, and create a more inclusive and representative media landscape for all. 2. Psychoanalytic foundations. The ways in which we perceive the world, and particularly others, are profoundly shaped by cultural and societal forces. The captivating realm of visual media, from the silver screen to the glossy pages of magazines, holds a particular power in shaping our understanding of gender and desire. This exploration delves into the complex and often unsettling dynamics of looking and being looked at, drawing upon the seminal work of psychoanalytic thinkers like Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan, alongside feminist critiques of visual culture. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, recognized the potent role of looking in our psychological development. He argued that the pleasure of looking, termed scopophilia, is deeply intertwined with our earliest experiences of sexuality and desire. This pleasure, Freud believed, originates in infancy, a time when the world is explored through the senses, with the gaze holding a primal fascination. Consider a baby mesmerized by the movement of a mobile or captivated by the sight of a caregiver's face. These early experiences, according to Freud, lay the foundation for the visual pleasures we experience throughout life, including those associated with art, film, and the human form. This concept of scopophilia takes on a complex dimension when we consider its connection to sexual desire. Freud argued that looking itself can be inherently erotic, a source of both pleasure and anxiety. This anxiety, he posited, stems from the very nature of desire, which always carries with it the potential for both fulfillment and frustration. Freud's ideas about scopophilia and its connection to sexual desire found fertile ground in film theory, particularly in the work of Laura Mulvey, who coined the term, the male gaze. Mulvey, drawing upon Freud's concepts, argued that traditional Hollywood cinema, with its emphasis on visual storytelling, often caters to a male spectator, framing women as objects of desire for both male characters within the film and the audience watching it. This gaze, Mulvey contended, is not merely a neutral act of observation but rather a powerful force that shapes our understanding of gender roles and power dynamics. Think of the classic film noir trope of the femme fatale, a beautiful, alluring, and ultimately dangerous woman who becomes an object of both fascination and fear for the male protagonist. Her image, often shrouded in shadow and smoke, becomes a projection of male anxieties and desires, reinforcing a power dynamic where women are defined by their visual appeal and their potential to both entice and betray. While Freud laid the groundwork for understanding the psychological underpinnings of looking, French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan offered another layer to this intricate tapestry with his concept of the mirror stage. Lacan argued that a pivotal moment occurs in early childhood, around 6 to 18 months of age, when an infant encounters their reflection in a mirror and begins to recognize themselves as a separate entity. This recognition, however, is not without its complexities. Lacan argued that the image the infant sees is both alluring and alienating. It is alluring because it presents a sense of wholeness and mastery that the infant, still developing coordination and a sense of self, does not yet possess. Yet, it is also alienating because this image is ultimately an illusion, a projection that does not fully encompass the messy, embodied reality of the infant's lived experience. Think of a child enthralled by their reflection in a mirror, giggling and reaching out to touch the image that seems both familiar and otherworldly. This fascination, Lacan argued, reveals a fundamental human desire for completion, for a sense of wholeness and mastery that we strive for throughout our lives. The mirror stage, however, is not merely a phase we grow out of. Lacan argued that it continues to shape our relationship with the world and with others, particularly in how we present ourselves and seek recognition from those around us. We become, in a sense, actors on a stage, internalizing the gaze of others and striving to project an image of ourselves that aligns with societal expectations. The cinematic experience, with its darkened theaters and larger-than-life projections, becomes a potent space where these dynamics of looking and being looked at play out. The darkened theater becomes a kind of symbolic return to the primal scene of the mirror stage. We, the audience, are plunged back into a state of darkness and absorption, our gaze fixated on the illuminated screen where images flicker and move, captivating our senses and drawing us into their narratives. In this heightened state of receptivity, the film's construction of the gaze takes on a particular potency. As spectators, we are invited to identify with certain characters, often the protagonists, and to experience the world through their eyes. This is where the interplay of voyeurism and narcissism comes into play. Voyeurism, in its simplest terms, refers to the pleasure derived from looking at others, particularly when those others are unaware of being watched. This pleasure, some argue, is amplified in the cinematic experience, where we are granted access to private moments, intimate conversations, and hidden desires of the characters on screen. We become, in a sense, invisible observers, privy to secrets and transgressions that would normally be kept hidden from view. Narcissism, on the other hand, refers to an excessive preoccupation with oneself and one's own image. While often viewed negatively, narcissism, like voyeurism, is also seen as an inherent part of the cinematic experience. The male gaze, deeply rooted in societal power structures that privilege the masculine perspective, often seeks to control and dominate the female form through over-sexualization. This dynamic plays out in myriad ways, from the lingering camera shots that objectify women's bodies to the narratives that often relegate women to roles defined by their relationship to men, be it as mothers, daughters, lovers, or victims. Consider the classic horror film trope of the final girl, who often survives by adhering to traditional notions of femininity, appearing non-threatening and virtuous in contrast to her more rebellious and often sexualized female counterparts who meet a gruesome end. This over-sexualization, however, is not simply about desire. It can also be read as a manifestation of castration anxiety, a concept central to Freudian psychoanalysis. Castration anxiety, in its simplest terms, refers to a deep-seated fear of emasculation, of losing one's power and masculinity. This fear, Freud argued, originates in childhood, during the Oedipal complex, when a boy develops an unconscious sexual desire for his mother and sees his father as a rival for her affections. This rivalry, according to Freud, leads to a fear of castration by the father, a fear that becomes repressed but continues to shape the boy's psyche and his relationships with women. In the context of the male gaze, castration anxiety manifests as a need to control and contain female sexuality. By objectifying and fetishizing women's bodies, the male gaze seeks to neutralize the perceived threat of female power and agency. This dynamic is particularly evident in genres like film noir, where women are often depicted as alluring but ultimately dangerous figures who must be punished or redeemed by the male protagonist. Think of the classic femme fatale, often clad in tight-fitting clothing that accentuates her curves, her lips painted a seductive red. She is both desired and feared, her sexuality a source of both fascination and anxiety for the male characters and, by extension, the audience. The concept of to be looked at-ness, as explored by feminist film theorists like Mulvey, highlights the ways in which women's agency is often constrained within visual media. Women, in many films, are not active agents in their own stories but rather objects to be looked at, their worth often determined by their adherence to societal standards of beauty and desirability. This dynamic is further complicated by the intersection of gender with other identity markers like race, class, and sexual orientation, which shape how individuals are perceived and represented within visual culture. Think of the limited and often stereotypical portrayals of women of color in Hollywood, who have historically been typecast in roles that reinforce racist and sexist tropes. The pervasiveness of the male gaze, however, does not mean that women are powerless in the face of these visual dynamics. The act of looking back, of critically engaging with the ways in which women are represented and of reclaiming the gaze, has been a powerful tool for feminist filmmakers and artists seeking to challenge these entrenched power dynamics. From the groundbreaking work of directors like Chantal Akerman and Sally Potter to the contemporary films of Ava DuVernay and Greta Gerwig, women have been instrumental in creating alternative cinematic languages that challenge the male gaze and offer more nuanced and complex portrayals of women's lives and experiences. These filmmakers often employ techniques that disrupt traditional cinematic language, such as subverting conventional camera angles, focusing on female pleasure and desire, and centering women's voices and perspectives in their narratives. The male gaze, with its roots in psychoanalytic theory and its pervasive presence in visual media, remains a powerful force in shaping our understanding of gender, desire, and power. However, by critically engaging with these concepts, by recognizing the ways in which they operate both consciously and unconsciously, and by supporting the work of artists who challenge these norms, we can move towards a more equitable and representative visual culture. 3. Mechanics and manifestations. The way we perceive the world, particularly through the lens of visual media, is deeply intertwined with cultural norms and power structures. For decades, feminist scholars and media critics have explored a pervasive phenomenon known as the male gaze, highlighting how cinematic representations often prioritize a masculine perspective, ultimately shaping how we view and understand gender roles. This essay delves into the mechanics and manifestations of the male gaze in film, analyzing its impact on our cultural landscape and examining its enduring influence on contemporary media. The camera, in the hands of a filmmaker, becomes a powerful tool that shapes narrative and guides our perception. When this power is wielded through a lens primarily informed by the male perspective, it can contribute to the framing of women as objects of desire rather than complex individuals. This is not to say that every film made by a man inherently perpetuates the male gaze. However, there is a clear pattern throughout cinematic history where the camera lingers on a woman's body, fragmenting her into visually appealing parts, while male characters often dictate the action and drive the plot forward. Consider Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, a film lauded for its suspenseful narrative and stunning visuals. The camera work, while masterful, frequently objectifies Kim Novak's character, Madeline. Her appearance is meticulously constructed and fetishized, her identity shrouded in mystery, serving more as a catalyst for the male protagonist's obsession than a fully realized individual. The objectification of the female form is often amplified through traditional cinematic techniques. Close-ups, camera angles, and lighting are employed not only to enhance the narrative but also to emphasize female sexuality, often at the expense of a woman's agency. A prime example of this can be found in the film adaptation of Lolita, 1962. While controversial for its subject matter, the film utilizes close-ups on Sue Leon's lips and body, emphasizing her youthfulness and sexuality in a way that is undeniably geared towards a male viewer's gaze. This deliberate framing of her image reinforces the power imbalance inherent in the narrative, reducing Lolita to a mere object of desire and further normalizing the sexualization of young women. This tendency to fragment the female body, focusing on specific features deemed desirable, is a recurring motif in cinema. From Marilyn Monroe's billowing skirt in The 7-Year Itch to the slow-motion beach run in Baywatch, the camera often zeroes in on body parts, presenting them as spectacles for consumption. This fragmentation serves to dehumanize and objectify, reducing women to a collection of desirable attributes rather than portraying them as whole, multifaceted beings. This isn't limited to Hollywood's golden age or exploitative genres. Even seemingly progressive films can fall prey to these tropes. Take, for instance, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where despite attempts to showcase powerful female characters, Scarlett Johansson's Black Widow was often subjected to the male gaze. Her skin-tight costume and the camera's frequent focus on her physique undermined her character's strength and agency, feeding into the larger societal expectation that women must be both powerful and conventionally attractive. The femme fatale, a character trope deeply rooted in film noir, further exemplifies the association of female beauty with danger and deceit. This archetype, often characterized by her allure, intelligence, and ultimately, her threat to the male protagonist, reinforces the notion that women with agency pose a risk to the established patriarchal order. Films like Double Indemnity, 1944, and The Lady from Shanghai, 1947, feature classic femme fatales who captivate and manipulate, only to meet tragic ends. This narrative punishment of strong, independent women serves as a cautionary tale, implicitly discouraging female viewers from embracing their agency and ambition. Furthermore, the male gaze manifests in the often stark contrast between male and female characters' roles in film. Men are frequently depicted as active agents, driving the plot, engaging in physical feats, and making decisions that impact the narrative. Women, on the other hand, often occupy passive roles, serving as love interests, damsels in distress, or simply existing as visual adornments within a male-dominated world. This dynamic reinforces traditional gender roles, perpetuating the idea that men are the doers, the thinkers, the heroes, while women are relegated to the sidelines, defined by their relationships to men and valued primarily for their physical attributes. This is not to suggest that women are entirely absent from complex or empowering roles in film. However, it is essential to acknowledge that these representations often exist in opposition to a dominant cinematic language that has, for decades, favored the male perspective. The male gaze, with its tendency to objectify, fragment, and control the representation of women, has profoundly impacted our cultural understanding of gender and shaped our expectations of how men and women should behave. As viewers, we must critically engage with the media we consume, recognizing and challenging these harmful tropes, and advocating for more diverse and equitable representations of women in film. 4. The female gaze and beyond. The way we perceive the world, particularly through the lens of visual media, is deeply intertwined with societal power structures. For decades, feminist scholars and media critics have dissected how traditional cinema, often crafted through a male-dominated perspective, shapes our understanding of gender, sexuality, and power. This exploration goes beyond simply pointing fingers. It's about unraveling the ingrained narratives that have shaped our cultural consciousness and, more importantly, envisioning a future where diverse voices and perspectives dismantle these restrictive frameworks. Critiques of the male gaze, a term coined by film theorist Laura Mulvey, aren't about censoring artistic expression but about recognizing the inherent power dynamics when women are primarily portrayed as objects of desire for a presumed male viewer. This critique recognizes the historical context. For centuries, women in art have been depicted through a male lens, often idealized, eroticized, or relegated to passive roles. Consider Renaissance paintings where the female nude, while technically impressive, often served a male viewer's pleasure. This visual language, consciously or unconsciously, seeps into our collective understanding. Think of classic Hollywood films, where the camera often lingered on a woman's body, emphasizing her physical attributes over her interiority. Even powerful female characters were often framed within the context of their attractiveness to men. This isn't to say these films lack merit, but rather to acknowledge the pervasive nature of the male gaze. It's about recognizing the subtle ways women are framed, not as active agents in their own narratives, but as accessories to the male protagonist's stories. The call for more nuanced representations of women in media isn't about portraying them as flawless beings. It's about reflecting the complexities of real women with agency, flaws, desires, and motivations that exist beyond the male gaze. Imagine a film where a woman's intelligence, her strength, or her vulnerability take center stage, not to cater to a male character's arc, but to tell her own story authentically. This shift requires a conscious effort from creators, both men and women, to challenge ingrained biases and to imagine stories that move beyond the limitations of the male gaze. It's about recognizing the power of representation and understanding that when women are allowed to see themselves reflected in their full humanity on screen, it empowers them to challenge societal expectations and forge their own paths. The male gaze, however, isn't the only way to view the world. Just as women experience and interpret reality differently, so too do they engage with visual media in unique ways. This brings us to the concept of the female gaze, a term that goes beyond simply reversing the gender roles of the viewer and the viewed. The female gaze explores how women, informed by their lived experiences, engage with visual narratives. This isn't about objectifying men in the same way women have been. It's about showcasing female desire, intimacy, and connection in ways that feel authentic to women's experiences. Consider the work of filmmakers like Jane Campion or Sofia Coppola, whose films often explore themes of female desire, relationships, and interiority with a sensitivity and nuance that feels distinctly feminine. These films often prioritize emotional landscapes over spectacle, exploring the complexities of female relationships and interiority. Think of a film like Thelma and Louise, where the female gaze is evident not just in the portrayal of female friendship but also in the way the camera captures their journey of self-discovery and rebellion against patriarchal constraints. Or consider a film like Lady Bird, where the female gaze offers an intimate and often messy portrayal of a young woman's coming of age, free from the judgment or idealization often present in male-directed coming-of-age stories. The female gaze isn't limited to film. It's evident in photography, painting, and other visual mediums where women artists challenge traditional notions of beauty and representation. It's about reclaiming agency over their own narratives and bodies, offering a more authentic and multifaceted representation of womanhood. However, it's crucial to acknowledge that the female gaze isn't a monolithic entity. It's as diverse as the women who experience it. A woman's race, sexual orientation, cultural background, and personal experiences all inform her gaze, adding further layers of complexity and nuance. The increasing prevalence of films and television shows directed and produced by women marks a significant shift in how stories are told and who gets to tell them. This isn't about excluding men from the conversation. It's about creating a more inclusive and representative media landscape where previously marginalized voices are given a platform. When women are behind the camera, the impact is undeniable. Stories that were once relegated to the sidelines or told through a male lens are now being explored with depth and sensitivity. These films offer fresh perspectives on universal themes, challenging traditional tropes and offering new ways of seeing the world. Consider the groundbreaking work of Ava DuVernay, whose films like Selma and 13th tackle complex social issues with a powerful and unflinching gaze, or the films of Greta Gerwig, whose sharp wit and insightful observations on female relationships and ambition have resonated with audiences worldwide. It's not just about the stories being told, it's also about how they are told. When women are in positions of power behind the scenes, it impacts the entire production. From the writing to the casting to the cinematography, there's a different sensibility, a different way of approaching storytelling that challenges the traditional Hollywood system. The emergence of streaming platforms has also played a crucial role in amplifying these diverse voices. With more opportunities for content creation and distribution, we're seeing a wider range of stories being told, many of which challenge the hegemonic grip of the male gaze. However, there's still a long way to go. The number of women in leadership roles in Hollywood remains disproportionately low, and systemic barriers continue to make it challenging for female filmmakers to get their projects greenlit and financed. Yet, the momentum is undeniable. As more women break through these barriers and achieve success on their own terms, they pave the way for future generations of filmmakers. It's a gradual but essential shift, one that promises a future where the stories we see on screen reflect the richness and diversity of our world. Bell Hooks, the renowned feminist scholar and cultural critic, introduced the concept of the oppositional gaze as a powerful tool for marginalized groups to critique and challenge dominant representations. Recognizing that the gaze is never neutral, Hooks argued that marginalized groups, often subjected to stereotypical or limited portrayals, can resist these representations by actively engaging with them, questioning their underlying assumptions, and offering alternative interpretations. The oppositional gaze is not about rejecting dominant narratives entirely, but rather about interrogating them, subverting their intended meanings, and reclaiming agency over how marginalized groups are represented. It's about recognizing the power dynamics inherent in the act of looking and refusing to be passively defined by the gaze of those in positions of power. A powerful example of the oppositional gaze can be seen in the work of artist Kara Walker, whose provocative silhouettes challenge romanticized narratives of the antebellum South by exposing the brutality and violence of slavery. Walker's art forces viewers to confront the uncomfortable realities of history, using the visual language of the dominant culture to critique and subvert its power. The oppositional gaze is also evident in the work of contemporary filmmakers like Jordan Peele, whose films like Get Out and S use horror tropes to explore themes of race, class, and social injustice. Peele's films challenge audiences to confront their own biases and complicity in perpetuating systemic inequality. For marginalized groups, the oppositional gaze is not just an act of resistance, it's also a means of survival. By questioning dominant narratives and offering alternative perspectives, marginalized communities reclaim their agency, challenge stereotypes, and create space for their own stories to be told. The importance of the oppositional gaze extends beyond the realm of art and media. It's a valuable tool for navigating a world saturated with images and messages that often reinforce existing power structures. By cultivating an oppositional gaze, we can become more critical consumers of media, questioning what we see and challenging representations that perpetuate harm or injustice. The male gaze, the female gaze, and the oppositional gaze each provide a unique lens through which to understand the complex relationship between visual media and power. However, to truly challenge the hegemony of any single perspective, we must embrace the principles of diversity and intersectionality. Diversity. in this context, means acknowledging and amplifying the voices and experiences of those who have been historically marginalized or underrepresented. It means ensuring that the stories we tell and the images we create reflect the multifaceted reality of our world. Intersectionality, a term coined by legal scholar Kimberlé Crenshaw, reminds us that identities are not monolithic. We each exist at the intersection of multiple identities, including race, gender, sexual orientation, class, ability, and more. These identities intersect and inform one another, shaping our experiences and perspectives in unique ways. To dismantle the male gaze and create a more equitable media landscape, we must adopt an intersectional lens that recognizes the diversity of experiences within and across gender identities. It means understanding that a Black woman's experience of the male gaze will differ from that of a white woman, and that a transgender woman's experience will differ yet again. Intersectionality challenges us to move beyond simplistic representations and delve into the complexities of human experience. It encourages us to create narratives that reflect the nuances of identity, acknowledging the ways in which race, class, sexual orientation, and other factors shape our perceptions and interactions with the world. This intersectional approach is not about ticking off boxes on a diversity checklist. It's about creating a media landscape that authentically reflects the richness and complexity of our world. It's about recognizing that true equality and representation require an ongoing commitment to challenging our own biases, amplifying marginalized voices, and creating space for stories that challenge the status quo. By embracing diversity and intersectionality, we can move beyond the limitations of the male gaze and create a more inclusive and equitable media landscape that reflects the full spectrum of human experience. It's a continuous journey that requires critical engagement, open dialogue, and a willingness to challenge the status quo to imagine a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and represented. 5. Contemporary implications and challenges. The pervasive presence of the male gaze in media and popular culture has been a subject of intense scrutiny and debate, particularly in the context of its influence on how we perceive gender, sexuality, and power dynamics. While originating from feminist film theory, the concept of the male gaze has transcended academic boundaries and infiltrated public discourse, prompting us to question the ways in which visual representations shape our understanding of the world around us. From advertising to social media, from Hollywood blockbusters to independent cinema, the male gaze continues to exert its influence, often subtly and unconsciously, shaping our perceptions of femininity, masculinity, and the complex interplay between the two. One of the most prominent manifestations of the male gaze can be observed in the realm of advertising, where women's bodies are frequently objectified and fragmented to appeal to a presumed heterosexual male viewer. This often involves focusing on specific body parts, such as breasts, legs, or buttocks, while minimizing or obscuring the woman's face and individuality. Consider, for instance, the ubiquitous imagery of women draped suggestively over cars at auto shows, their bodies contorted into unnatural poses that emphasize their curves and sexual availability. Or think of beer commercials that feature scantily clad women frolicking on beaches or cheering on sports teams, their presence seemingly intended to titillate and distract rather than to represent any meaningful aspect of the product being advertised. In such instances, women are reduced to mere commodities, their bodies serving as props to enhance the perceived desirability of the products they are associated with. The pervasiveness of the male gaze extends far beyond the glossy pages of magazines and the flickering screens of our televisions. It has become deeply ingrained in the fabric of our digital lives, particularly within the realm of social media. Platforms such as Instagram, TikTok, and Snapchat, while offering avenues for self-expression and connection, have also become breeding grounds for the objectification and sexualization of women. The pressure to curate a picture-perfect online persona often leads to the amplification of unrealistic beauty standards, with filters, Facetune, and carefully staged photos becoming the norm rather than the exception. Influencers and celebrities, with their legions of followers, often perpetuate these unattainable ideals, showcasing impossibly flawless skin, hourglass figures, and perfectly plump lips, further reinforcing the notion that a woman's worth is inextricably linked to her physical appearance. The insidious nature of the male gaze lies in its ability to influence not only how women are perceived by others but also how they perceive themselves. The constant bombardment of idealized images, often digitally altered to achieve an impossible standard of perfection, can have a profoundly detrimental impact on women's self-image and self-esteem. The internalization of these unrealistic beauty standards can lead to feelings of inadequacy, anxiety, and self-doubt, as women strive to conform to an unattainable ideal that exists solely within the confines of patriarchal fantasy. Eating disorders, body dysmorphia, and low self-worth are just a few of the devastating consequences that can arise from the relentless pressure to conform to the male gaze. The relationship between the male gaze and issues of consent, sexual harassment, and violence against women is a complex and deeply troubling one. When women are consistently objectified and reduced to their physical attributes, it creates a culture in which their voices are silenced, their boundaries are disregarded, and their humanity is diminished. This can contribute to a climate where sexual harassment and assault are normalized, excused, or even encouraged. Consider, for instance, the pervasive nature of street harassment, where men feel entitled to comment on women's bodies, make lewd gestures, or even follow them without their consent. This behavior, often dismissed as harmless flirting, is rooted in the same objectification and power imbalance that fuels the male gaze, creating an environment where women feel unsafe, disrespected, and violated. The emergence of feminist film theory in the 1970s, spearheaded by scholars like Laura Mulvey, marked a pivotal moment in the fight against the male gaze and its harmful consequences. Mulvey's groundbreaking essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, published in 1975, provided a framework for understanding how traditional cinematic techniques often reinforce patriarchal power structures and objectify women. Her work challenged the assumption that cinema is a neutral medium, arguing instead that the very act of looking is inherently imbued with power dynamics and gendered assumptions. By deconstructing the mechanics of the male gaze, Mulvey and other feminist film theorists empowered generations of scholars, critics, and filmmakers to challenge dominant representations of gender and sexuality in visual media. The ongoing debate surrounding the male gaze and its relevance in a rapidly evolving media landscape reflects the complex and multifaceted nature of this issue. Some argue that the concept of the male gaze, while undoubtedly groundbreaking in its time, is outdated and no longer relevant in an era of increased female representation in media. They point to the rise of female filmmakers, writers, and producers as evidence of a shift in perspective, arguing that the male gaze is being challenged and subverted from within the industry. Others, however, contend that the male gaze remains a powerful force, even if it manifests in more subtle and insidious ways. They argue that the increased visibility of women in media does not necessarily equate to a dismantling of patriarchal power structures or a fundamental shift in how women are perceived and represented. The pervasiveness of the male gaze in our visual culture has far-reaching implications, shaping not only our individual perceptions but also our collective understanding of gender, sexuality, and power. By raising awareness about the insidious ways in which the male gaze operates, we can begin to challenge its dominance and create a more equitable and representative media landscape. Through critical engagement with visual media, we can empower ourselves and future generations to recognize, deconstruct, and ultimately dismantle the harmful stereotypes and power imbalances that the male gaze perpetuates. The journey towards a more just and equitable society requires us to confront the deeply ingrained biases and assumptions that shape our perceptions of the world, and challenging the male gaze is an essential step in this ongoing struggle. As we conclude this exploration of the male gaze, it's important to emphasize that this isn't just about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about fostering awareness, sparking critical thinking, and ultimately, inspiring change. It's about recognizing the ways in which visual media, often subtly and unconsciously, shapes our perceptions of gender, power, and ourselves. The male gaze, with its roots in historical power structures and its enduring presence in our image-saturated world, presents a challenge, but it also offers an opportunity. By understanding the mechanics of the male gaze, by recognizing its manifestations in film, advertising, and social media, we empower ourselves to become more critical consumers of visual culture. We can start to question the images we consume, challenge representations that feel limiting or harmful, and support artists and filmmakers who are actively working to dismantle these restrictive frameworks. But this isn't a journey we take alone. It requires open dialogue, thoughtful engagement, and a willingness to listen to and learn from one another's experiences. So, let's continue the conversation in the comments below. Share your thoughts, experiences, and questions. Have you ever felt objectified or unseen by the male gaze? What films or TV shows do you think challenge these traditional representations? And if you found this exploration valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving this video a thumbs up, and sharing it with your friends. Together, we can continue to delve into these fascinating and important aspects of culture and the humanities, exploring how they shape who we are, how we see the world, and how we can create a more just and equitable future for all. Thanks for watching.